at least than yesterday. Before we begin, I'm going to let you know that manuscript of Professor Graham's lecture is on the website. You can download from the website and follow through as she lectures. It's at IAPT's website, and on the keynote speaker introduction, you can find the files over there. All right. Today's keynote speaker is, as you all know, is Professor Elaine Graham. I know that you're all familiar with her, but still, I'm gonna introduce to you her accomplishments and her work of academic journey. She was educated at the University of Bristol and Manchester, and she was the Grosvenor Research Professor of Practical Theology at the University of Chester from 2009 until her retirement in July 2021. She now holds the title Professor Emerita. Between 1998 to 2009, she was Samuel Ferguson Professor of Social and Pastoral Theology at the University of Manchester. She's the author of several major books, and if I read them all, we won't go on to the lecture. So I'm just going to name a few, which are Transforming Practice, 1996, Representations of the Post-Human, 2002, and Words Made Flesh, 2009. Her most recent work considers public theology as a form of Christian apologetics. She published Between a Rock and a Hard Place, Public Theology in a Post-Secular Age in 2013, and Apologetics Without Apology, Speaking of God in a World Troubled by Religion in 2017. She was president of the International Academy of Practical Theology between 2005 to 2007. In July 2021, she was elected a Fellow of the British Academy. Her current research interests include an examination of the life, thought, and legacy of the Cambridge philosopher and theologian Don Cupitt, as well as continued interest in religion and popular culture and public theology and post-secularity. The title of the lecture that she's giving us today is Another World, Practical Wisdom for the End Times. Let's give a big warm applause as we have Professor Elaine Graham to the podium.
Thank you, Clara, and thanks to the organisers for the invitation. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be with you this morning. In his book, The Great Derangement, the Indian novelist and critic Amitav Ghosh asks why contemporary literature has been so reluctant to engage with themes of climate emergency and environmental crisis. He suspects that the coming of the era of the Anthropocene, in which, I quote, humans have become geological agents, changing the most basic physical processes of the Earth, represents too enormous and fundamental a challenge to life on Earth to fit comfortably within the conventions of realist fiction. Future generations, if they survive, will surely conclude that ours was a time... Sorry, I'm going the wrong way. Future generations, if they survive, will surely conclude that ours was a time when most forms of art and literature were drawn into the moments of concealment that prevented people from recognizing the realities of their plight. Quite possibly then, this era, which so congratulates itself on its self-awareness, will come to be known as the time of the Great Derangement. It is as if, Ghosh continues, the mere mention of the subject of climate emergency is often enough to relegate a novel or a short story to the genre of science fiction. It is as though, in the literary imagination, climate change was somehow akin to extraterrestrials or interplanetary travel. With its emphasis on the ordinary and the everyday, Ghosh regards much Euro-American realistic fiction as too focused on personal moral responsibility at the expense of long-term structural and collective social action. Nevertheless, Gauche suggests that an alternative literary and artistic genre, that of science fiction, may prove more adequate to the task, but not those kinds which deal with aliens or intergalactic travel, or which are set in the far distant future, but those varieties that, while rooted in a recognisable present, are capable of making a leap of imagination that reflects, as Gauche says, the uncanniness and the improbability, the magnitude and interconnectedness of the transformations that are now underway. And indeed, the emergence over the past 20 years of a specific branch or genre of science fiction known as cli-fi may go some way towards addressing Gauche's concerns. In their attempts to capture some of the gravity and epoch-changing scale of the impact of the Anthropocene, cli-fi writers and artists are attempting to read the signs of the times by deploying different modes or registers, chief among which is the deployment of the conventions of apocalyptic discourse. In the cli-fi version of apocalyptic, hubristic human affairs meet their nemesis in ecocide. It begins from the premise that the pressures of climate emergency will signal forms of social collapse and catastrophe, such as war between nations or communities for vital resources, or the totalitarian appropriation of populations, food supplies, and sustainable habitats. What is remarkable, however, is the degree to which the various themes and tropes of contemporary cli-fi apocalypse draw on much older imaginings, including those from biblical literature. And this continuity of mythical, narrative, and symbolic ways of depicting possible futures continues to shape the contemporary cultural imaginations. And while contemporary cli-fi addresses questions of crisis and disruption and their consequences, it rarely fulfills the fuller theological meaning of apocalypse, which is best understood as an overturning of established ways of life in order to rebuild and renew. So it is interruption, but then reconstruction. Classically, these apocalyptic narratives consist of a warning about a coming crisis, possibly initiated by supernatural or elemental forces, as well as human powers, after which a new order will be inaugurated, which represents a more perfect state to which in which God's purposes will be realised. So in this lecture, I want to sketch out 4 key themes or motifs that emerge out of cli-fi culture and examine them for their deeper meanings. I'll then engage in some critical and constructive theological reflection in order to see how well cli-fi apocalyptic literature then and now might help to advance our thinking on some of the following questions. How does the idea of climate emergency as apocalyptic event disrupt or trouble our worldview and our way of life? So this is about the impact of the Anthropocene and the resulting response to climate anxiety, catastrophe and collapse. Does the idea of an approaching crisis or catastrophe freeze us into inaction or free us to think anew? And how do we construct, communicate and inhabit new narratives of hope beyond the Anthropocene, beyond the current crisis? Where would such practical wisdom for living spring from, and what would it look like? As we've been learning, the concept of the Anthropocene denotes the most recent period in Earth's history when human activity started to have a significant impact on the planet's climate and ecosystems. It reflects the apprehension that a vast number of changes to the Earth's environment, from global climate change to soil degradation to the disappearance of animal and plant species, acidification and warming of the oceans, melting of the ice caps, and the proliferation of artificial substances such as plastics in virtually all forms of life are both unprecedented and unpredictable. Clearly, there are scientific, political, and economic dimensions to the question of how further destruction and degradation of the planet can be averted. But we can also assert, I think, that the Anthropocene represents a crisis of meaning alongside those material and physical conditions of climate crisis. This leads, as Horn and Bergthaler have said, to the fundamental insight that in order to grapple with the ecological effects of human behaviour, one must also understand the systems of belief and the social structures which condition that behaviour. One must also understand the conditions of belief which condition that behaviour and which play a decisive role in how societies react or fail to react to developments in the sciences. So there's a convergence or interplay here between the material and the metaphysical, between the so-called natural sciences and the arts, humanities, philosophy, and social sciences, emerging of matters of fact or data and of values and beliefs, such that Bruno Latour has argued that we can no longer speak about matters of fact, but address issues of climate emergency more as matters of concern. Inasmuch as scientific hypotheses and theoretical models are themselves constructs or linguistic representations that give us purchase on the world around us, so products of creative imagination are also essentially thought experiments. To quote Paul Ricoeur, they are heuristic fictions for redescribing reality. They're things to think with. For Ricoeur, all representations of the world, be they scientific or artistic, serve as fictive texts, offering up new possibilities of being in the world, which may not exist in a physical material sense, but nevertheless possess the imaginative ability to shape reality through the effect they have on our mindset and our cognitive and imaginative worlds. So the symbolic means by which environmental matters are represented and negotiated are always freighted with deeper sets of assumptions and ideologies. In what follows then, I don't propose so much to engage in biblical and theological expositions of the meaning of eschaton or apocalypse before then applying them to contemporary culture. Rather, my intention is to bring culture and Bible and theology into conversation and to explore how a deeper understanding of the dynamics of the apocalyptic imagination today resonates with a continuity of that imagination, but then how that conversation might enable us to forge a practical theological wisdom that sustains a vision for change and living differently in the future. My former colleague Dawn Llewellyn at the University of Chester has paid particular attention to this relationship between fiction, lived experience, and spiritual understanding and formation. And she has argued for recognising reading as a spiritual resource for many contemporary Christian and post-Christian women. While this can be largely an individual practice, Llewellyn argues that women do use reading practices as ways of forging communities. And there's a blurring also of sacred and secular, as many women derive spiritual meaning from non-religious texts and interpret works from religious canons such as the Bible in new ways, a process Dawn terms filtering. And these, she argues, serve powerfully to affirm feminist-orientated spiritual journeys. And this again suggests to me a conversation of blurring of boundaries and interaction, not just in the way we perceive the extended afterlife of Jewish and Christian text from the Bible into the present, but in the ways contemporary secular audiences might be making spiritual interpretations of popular works of film, art, and fiction. And from a secular perspective of international studies or international relations, the scholar Delph Roth has argued that discourses on the Anthropocene are deeply influenced by a common orientation towards the threat of the end of time, which invoke and update key symbols, images, and storylines of Christian political theology. There are many good reasons for including insights from contemporary culture as a locus theologicus then, as a place where God acts and speaks, and where humans' engagement with God becomes manifest in an alternative medium that harnesses the creative imagination and which resonates generatively and evocatively. So I'm following the pattern of much practical theology, therefore, in adopting a dialogical or conversational mode, in attempting to set up a dynamic interaction between the understanding of God's purposes mediated through Christian tradition, but equally through the secular realities of life. Theological reflection of this kind proceeds from the heritage of faith in conversation with the imperatives of faithful living and questions posed by lived experience within every new generation. This inherited wisdom of tradition is brought to bear for the practical development of faith, rather than for the narrowly, deductively logical to prove God's existence. But in turn, the authenticity of such reflection, such conversation, is gauged by its ability to nurture moral, practical and political action and renewed religious practice. Reflections on the current environmental emergency stand in a tradition of perennial themes of crisis, loss, destruction and transformation that have always informed humanity's collective imagination. Yet crucially, they also serve as material for engendering practical wisdom that embodies visions designed to call us back to faithful action. As with much older science fiction and fantasy, movements such as cli-fi exercise both a critical function of unsettling or troubling the normality or taken for grantedness of the present, and a constructive task of imagining or projecting new worlds. They refract through often unexpected lenses aspects of our current situation and open up the possibility of alternatives, thereby disrupting and displacing the givenness of the present in order to sow the seeds of different ways of being in the world. So what kinds of worlds do such cultural forms refract back to us, and how in turn do they inform a constructive or transformative political and theological imaginary? A consistent theme runs throughout cli-fi and related cultural forms, that of crisis and collapse. Crisis and collapse. And this is what has led some to characterize this genre as akin to ancient apocalyptic literature. And this term generally refers to the extinction or collapse of life as we know it, and that's certainly a constant motif in contemporary culture. With climate collapse comes the breakdown of human civilization, and the various responses to this catastrophe forms the basis of cli-fi's narratives and denouements. For Gregor Anderson, such imaginings in cli-fi trace a gradual socio-anthropological deterioration, which takes us from a world where socio-political complexity is only just beginning to unravel to post-apocalyptic worlds, where the framework for peaceful coexistence has fully broken down. What is often revealed then is how the absence of social constraints and the collapse of normality, that disruptive impact, unleashes savage conflict. In spite of technological sophistication, human beings revert to a Hobbesian world of warring factions. Human collaboration descends into naked competition, and divisions between communities are laid bare. One example of this is Maya Lund's The History of Bees, in which the catastrophic effects of colony collapse disorder amongst the world's bee population leads to global conflict, world war, that impoverishes Europe and North America. Only in China, where an authoritarian government is able to impose restrictions on its population in the form of strict rationing and forced labour, does any kind of viable human society endure. How humanity responds to apocalyptic collapse varies, though, within cli-fi culture. And in order to unwrap some of these underlying meanings, I've constructed 4 ideal types, which I would argue recur consistently throughout contemporary cli-fi fiction. And although these are not exhaustive, and they're in a sense an offering for you as something to think with, I hope they focus our attention for now on this perceived relationship between struggling humanity, devastated non-human nature, and the consequences of the collapse or unravelling of that delicate relationship. And they also draw analogies between a post-anthropocentric future and those enduring themes that we find in biblical literature, biblical tradition. So I've identified these as Babel, Eden, Ark, and Flood. And as I say, they're open to revision, and I hope they spark your imagination. So firstly, the theme of Babel, which is a theme of hubris and technocracy. And in the light of what Ryan Lamoth was saying, I feel there are resonances also with what he was saying about this rather obsessive pursuit of sovereignty and human domination at all costs. Quite strong resonances there. In much sci-fi, and indeed in science fiction where there's a threat to human life that is unrelated to the Anthropocene, the dramatic tension is created through the narration of efforts by humanity to rescue the Earth from destruction, normally via quite sophisticated technological interventions. So speeding comets and rogue satellites are intercepted by daredevil astronauts, as in the blockbuster Armageddon. Biotechnological solutions feature too, as in Margaret Atwood's Oryx and Crake, in which humanity has been replaced by genetically engineered replicants designed to survive a depleted world following environmental catastrophe. This view is technocratic at heart, and it envisages a limitless future in terms of the continued inevitability of progress, constant change, and the virtual economic growth. A conviction that is securely underpinned by the authority of science. And it also rests in part, of course, on a Western understanding of time and history as linear, which is far from being a cultural universal. So the more the impact of human activity on the environment is conceived to be a threat to the very foundations of life on Earth, the more it calls into question the moral status of the very technological, epistemological, and economic assumptions of the everyday life of those who dwell in the industrialised West. But what is normally perceived to be the solution is actually possibly a part of the solution. As Charlotte Ridley, in her anthropological study of the Russian tundra, says, the proponents of this kind of good Anthropocene forge forward with their commitment to the continuity of human dominance, conferring certainty on a hyper-consuming white supremacist hierarchy that there is no need to scale back on environmental destruction, resource extraction and colonisation. Technology, in the end, will save us. But to what extent is that trope drawing on a more ancient narrative, that of the Tower of Babel in Genesis? In this story, humanity's efforts to build big through architectural and technological prowess, designed to mimic God's power, descends into hubris when the tower collapses. The collective effort dissolves into competing factions speaking different languages. Is this collapse the action of a jealous God, envious of human achievement, or one of protectiveness and warning, looking to save humanity from itself? One commentator, Ellen van Walder, argues that it is about humanity's attempt to build a single dwelling place, a kind of Promethean effort, to escape the contingency of the earth, but it is doomed to failure. Similarly, Mark Brett's post-colonial reading sees Babel as the expression of imperial ambitions, a land grab, an effacement of difference in a quest for artificial unity. So that's the theme of Babel, the technocratic hubris that will surely end in failure, and which constructs as a solution what is often perceived as the problem. My second theme is that of flood. And here we have the idea of nature as vengeful, as predator. This theme points to works that consider how humanity will have to face a kind of backlash from anthropogenic climate change. One famous example, perhaps, from popular culture is James Lovelock's Gaia hypothesis, first published in 2000, in which Earth is represented as a vast self-regulating organism, and humanity as an invasive parasite or dangerous virus that must be expelled and exterminated if the planet is to survive. In this way of thinking, humanity has in some way disturbed the equilibrium of the natural world, the integrity of the natural world by its actions. And now the non-human world wreaks its revenge, both judging and punishing us in what can only be described as cosmic acts of self-defense. This idea, I think, was a particularly popular trope in the B-movie science fiction cinema of the mid-20th century. So things like them, Godzilla, often these strange alien beings that have been irradiated by a neutron bomb or something and which unleash chaos and havoc on civilization the day the Earth stood still. Or even Daphne du Maurier's short story, The Birds, which was scaringly adapted by Alfred Hitchcock into a movie in 1963. But that theme of nature as backlash, nature fighting back, taking its vengeance, continued into popular movies in the 21st century, with movies such as The Day After Tomorrow in 2004, which depicts the catastrophic aftermath of rising sea levels caused by global warming. In this genre of contemporary apocalyptic, judgment is exercised through the unleashing of elemental forces, be they pandemics, monstrous or mutant creatures, or weather systems running amok. Nature is wreaking its revenge, red in tooth and claw. And as with the trope of Babel, human technological pretensions have overreached themselves fatally and tipped the delicate balance on which Earth's ecology depends. I'm thinking a bit further about this just this morning. Although very often the flood is depicted as divine punishment, and it is often exercised through the unleashing of the chaos of these calamitous and destructive natural forces. So perhaps in many narratives, such as one of the Genesis stories, creation is depicted as the imposing of order on creation, on formless creation. So maybe this idea of flood is actually the unleashing of disorder, once again, and entropy. So this motif of flood can appear as a narrative of vengeful nature, but also as a reminder of the interdependence between humanity and non-human nature, and perhaps a warning that we abrogate responsibility, we abandon responsibility for our technological creations at our peril. Arguably, this theme is as old as science fiction itself. In Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, first published in 1818, and that's an illustration from the original frontispiece, the desperate pursuit of Victor Frankenstein, the inventor, by his misbegotten creation, can be read as the creature's attempt to remind Victor of his responsibilities for his actions. It is in that respect a moral cry for science to respect the ties that bind humanity and its technological creations. And it's possible to see how contemporary versions resonate with more ancient literature, not just the Genesis story of the flood, but other myths, such as Plato's Atlantis, or the Epic of Gilgamesh, in which sinful humanity is wiped or washed from the face of the earth by divine judgment. Nature may take revenge also on political injustice as well as technological hubris, as in the plagues of Egypt in the book of Exodus, in which punishment is delivered by a series of freak natural phenomena, swarms of insects, storms, and disease. So this unleashing of elemental forces is a vehicle of divine wrath. My third motif is that of Eden, and here we have ideas of climate grief and the loss of innocence of nature occasioned by the Anthropocene. And ideas of nature in this strand come to stand for lost innocence, perhaps the loss of innocence on the part of humanity as well as that of nature. Bill McKibben's non-fiction work, The End of Nature, published in 1989, articulates this sense of nostalgia or climate grief for the diminishment of natural beauty and diversity. I think this trope rests heavily also on a form of romanticism, which stresses nature as a separate category, distinct from our interior worlds, and therefore something that can be objectively studied and hence physically damaged by us. Two recent fictional treatments, The Ice Lovers, published in 2009, and The Lamentations of Zeno, published in 2011, focus on the melting of the alpine glaciers and Arctic ice caps, respectively, as signifying a wider anthropogenic environmental damage. And this is construed in both these books as a form of anthropogenic violence. Both novelists' protagonists experience a profound affective, emotional, and cognitive empathy for the lost wilderness. They experience acute climate grief, which leads them to take drastic action on the side of degraded nature. And similarly, Camille Seaman's photographic essay, and I've got some pictures coming up later which we can show in the discussion. Her photographic essay, The Last Iceberg, is also an extended lament for this very tangible dimension of climate emergency. She charts the final journeys of massive ice flows as they melt and literally die due to the warming of the oceans. And she uses quite startling anthropomorphic language in her accompanying texts. She talks of images of icebergs as portraits of individuals, much like family photos of my ancestors. And her pictures are for her attempts to capture a moment in their life in which they convey their unique personality, some connection to their own experience, and a glimpse of their soul which endures. These are icebergs, and I think that's interesting, but I'm quite ambivalent about that language of these are like my relations, this is their soul. It certainly affords these icebergs a kind of dignity and agency. It reminds us of our affinity with these natural phenomena. But I think this mode of grief and romanticism is double-edged as well, because it may risk falling over into sentimentality, anthropomorphism, and somehow diminishing the elemental status of these icebergs. And all of that, I think, and Camille's really magnificent photos, all of that raises the question of how we talk about, represent the idea of nature under threat without objectifying and sentimentalizing it. And I'll go on a little bit later to talk about how we must move on from getting stuck in some of these kinds of tropes and move on. My final theme is that of arc, the idea of escape from climate emergency into a kind of safe haven or sanctuary. Like many Cli-Fi novels of the past 2 decades, Sarah Hall's The Carhallan Army, published in 2007, begins with the apocalyptic trope of social collapse, and then develops a narrative of the search for sanctuary or safe haven, escape, there to found a new and restored community that can embody utopian hopes of the perfect society. The lead character, known only as Sister, escapes from an authoritarian society struggling with the effects of climate collapse, to seek out a woman's commune in the Cumbrian hills. Those of you who know the north of England, this is near the Lake District area. There's joy for Sister and the community in the collaborative routines of carving a subsistence existence out of the wild landscape and learning to collaborate again with the rhythms and cycles of the natural world. But it becomes clear this refuge is more fragile than it seems. Like many earthly paradises and utopias, Carhallan cannot last, and attempts to protect its way of life end in violence. Other versions of this relate to a retreat into more technologically mediated and advanced sanctuaries. Post-climate collapse communities often can only survive through the manufacture of artificial environments. So in Boon Jong-ho's film adaptation of Snowpiercer, 2013, and Boon, of course, went on to direct Parasite, in the Snowpiercer, there's been a massive climate disaster brought about hubristically by scientific attempts to control the weather. So they try and slow down global warming, and they end up freezing the Earth entirely. So echoes of Babel and hubris there. But after this frozen disaster, the remnants of the world's population are confined to a giant tray that constantly circles the Earth, protecting its passengers from freezing temperatures, but effectively becoming a mobile prison in which existing socio-economic divisions are merely reinforced. So here we have various themes coming together: social collapse, global threat, the technocratic solution, and safe haven. But also, and I'm hearing already in some of the papers and comments that people are making, the way in which a crisis like the Anthropocene or even the COVID-19 pandemic simply lays bare and reinforces existing social inequalities. But that idea of escape from captivity or escape from collapse into a more haven of safety also has resonances with the biblical Exodus narrative. Octavia Butler's The Parable of the Sower, first published in 1993, and note again the biblical allusion in the title, is set in 2025, so get ready. And climate change has led to, guess what, universal social collapse. The heroine and narrator, Lauren Omamina, is one of many struggling to survive, and she takes it on herself to lead a group of refugees across the United States to safety, from the ruin of the cities towards another kind of refuge. Butler originally conceived of her post-apocalyptic sanctuary as an off-world space colony, and of course that theme of escaping a dying Earth to found new communities on other planets finds plenty of expression, not just in cli-fi narratives, but in some of the wider fever imaginations of our best-known billionaires. But the theme of Exodus is strong in the Parable of the Sower, and I'll come back to that because for the heroine Lauren and for Octavia Butler, this has a strong theological underpinning to it. So those are the four themes. Let's just unpack them a little bit more and try and subject them to a little bit more critique. As I've argued, these themes exemplify what might be considered thought experiments, which contemplate the prospects of environmental catastrophe and envisage different solutions. But none of them somehow appear entirely satisfactory. First, I feel there's something of an irony in that this kind of dystopian or apocalyptic vision of social collapse following climate disaster is actually the very opposite, the very antithesis of the social and even pan-species solidarity many would argue is necessary for our future ecological survival. So again, in the face of catastrophe, we kind of revert to type. We rely on technology and we split into factions rather than trying to find some kind of new solution. But how can we guarantee the survival of those we may never meet, or those unborn generations and species of the future, if we're not capable of building common cause with those around us here and now? And equally, in the sort of escalation of the technocratic vision, is there a danger that the rhetoric of science exceeding its natural or God-given limits results in a backlash against the very research into the threats posed by climate change itself? It's possible also that these cli-fi narratives of apocalypse won't spur us into action or provide a catalyst of change, but simply become yet another spectacle, yet another item for consumption, rather than representing a moral imperative. They pander to Hollywood's obsession with wrecked, militarized, post-natural environments with lots of special effects, with social meltdown, perpetual high-tech combat, directed at transforming apocalypse into exciting entertainment for the multitudes, what Naomi Klein has described as disaster capitalism, disaster porn, capitalism that welcomes environmental and social disaster as a source of profit. The 2021 Netflix movie Don't Look Up is in fact a parody of what we might term this mediatization of climate emergency, in which the impending collision of a giant comet with Earth, which is widely seen as a metaphor for anthropogenic environmental collapse, sees media corporations conspire with a kind of Elon Musk, eccentric billionaire tech entrepreneur, to bankroll a Babel-like attempt to destroy the approaching comet. And then after this has very publicly failed, the hubris, to fuel massive public denial of the impending prospect of total extinction. and in the process of one of the scientists involved becomes kind of swallowed up into the media circus and completely consumed by his own celebrity. Another thought is that overall, all the themes of hubris, safe haven, nostalgia and revenge, all of those four tropes seem to me to perpetuate, in some way, a dichotomy of human and nature, in which nature is either objectified, victimized, or feared. So Babel insists on business as usual, in which the old technocratic problems are presented as solutions. Eden objectifies nature as the passive victim of human encroachment. Ark assumes a safe haven can be established in isolation from any connection with the non-human. Flood identifies nature as predator. None of these sees an alternative way forward, in which human relations with its environment is restored to equilibrium and new relationships of interdependence are forged. But apocalypse not only represents crisis or collapse and the search for a way out, its religious and biblical roots frame it as essentially a turning point, a metanoia. It's both crisis and judgment, intended to locate the present context in the light of God's perennial purposes and to affirm divine, but not human sovereignty. But the collapse of the old is the recondition for the inauguration of the new. And often this is signified not just by a temporal break, but the notion that the new times will be located in an entirely new physical space. So in its fullest sense, apocalyptic speaks of the cathartic and invocational effect of life on earth. The rekindling of themes of apocalypse and impending crisis may be interpreted as entertaining spectacle for some, but in its classic sense, it embodies the kairos, a turning point, an opportune moment, a moment of truth, holding out the promise of moral reorientation. It speaks of a time of challenge and conversion that springs from the life-threatening processes of human action as a call to vision and renewal. So now I'd like to set out two brief theological themes that might inform a kind of practical theological wisdom. These are intended as action-guiding worldviews that express values and visions that help us shape lives of faithful discipleship in an age of crisis. And they are themes of a new heaven and a new earth, a re-enchanted good space in which God's will be done, and resurrection, hope beyond the suffering, as a sign of God's saving actions in history. And these themes and the practical theological wisdom that we might build from them is not about looking to escape from the world as it is, but to live and act in hope that our efforts might become physical and tangible expressions of God's deeper purposes. Firstly, a new heaven and a new earth. The New Jerusalem, the perfect city that will supersede the imperial power of Rome, is imagined as a huge megalopolis that covers the entire inhabited earth. It is full of signs and wonders to match any Hollywood blockbuster. But like much utopian or futuristic literature, might we read Revelation as both an eschatological vision of the end times and as a sideways commentary on its own present day? The vision of the writer of Revelation invites its readers to think the unthinkable, not just once but twice. First, to contemplate the coming catastrophe, and then to project themselves into an alternative imaginary, a place where there is no more hunger, want, or sorrow. Its refraction of the familiar into the fantastic or even utopian offers a chance to construct a prophetic yet profoundly contextualized imaginary vision of how the people of God might begin to anticipate the shape of the world to come, in and through their everyday practices of holiness, vigilance, and service. So this is a not return to the original garden. Our cli-fi fantasies of nostalgia and escape will not suffice. The New Jerusalem is not to be realized in the flight from the here and now. This future world has no outside, no rural idyll or sanctuary to which these very urban Christians of the book of Revelation could retreat. Instead, this is the building of a new, abundant and inclusive dwelling place for God and God's covenant people. A new Jerusalem, a great city where human cultures and all their diversity work together in peace and harmony before and under God. And the fact that this city is beyond human governance also reminds us of that delicate interconnection between ourselves and non-human nature. The language of stewardship, suppression, sovereignty from Ryan's paper yesterday, taming of wild nature, of colonisation, has no place in this world in which the only object of worship, the final authority, is not human will, but the life of God. So this is a city, a resurrection hope, that encompasses the oikos, the whole earth, under God, and not simply human self-interest. Secondly, the motif of resurrection, and particularly the idea of Holy Saturday, which I think I've drawn in recent years from the work of Shelley Rambo on trauma and Holy Saturday. Some of you may know her work. If the New Jerusalem represents a spatial narrative of a new era, then I think a Christian vision of the future is also fueled by the more temporal hope of the resurrection. In that respect, any vision of the end times, the eschaton, is inseparable from soteriology, an account of salvation, since both speak of the final endpoint, the consummation of God's redemptive action. Once again, this is something that encompasses the whole inhabited earth, as well as finding its fulfillment in Christ as the true end or logical purpose of history. And central to that salvation hope is the resurrection. But this again shows how our attempts to engage with the fear, the dread, the catastrophe of climate emergency will not be an easy victory. As Johannes Baptist Metz has argued, a remembrance of suffering is essential for a liberative eschatology and a liberative understanding of the cross and resurrection. And I found myself going back to Donna Haraway, and if you know my work, she's always been a great influence on me, but she talks in similar terms in her recent work on climate emergency. She talks about staying with the trouble, not an escape from our crisis, but a learning to be truly present, in order, she says, to forge a hardy, soiled kind of wisdom. So battered and bruised, we move on. We face up to the horror of climate emergency, but we move on and try and rebuild in the hope of resurrection. And indeed, this takes me back to the parable of the sower, where the heroine, Lauren Olamina, is faced by similar struggles with her own limitations and suffering. She must lead her disparate group of comrades to a new settlement. But in order to inspire this, Lauren must articulate the tenets of a new religion, one she finds founded on God of change and transformation. It's not enough to cling to the old ways or expect salvation to come in a world beyond this one. The essentials of Lauren's vision of what she calls the Earthseed community are expressed in this recurring poem or prayer. Oh, sorry, yeah, that's one of Camilla Simo's icebergs. So this is Laura Olamina. All that you touch, you change. All that you change, changes you. The only lasting truth is change. God is change. This idea of God as change serves as guiding metaphor for Lauren's unifying, purposeful life here on earth and the hope of heaven for humanity and its children. As Lauren says, this is a real heaven, not mythology or philosophy, a heaven that will be theirs, the communities, to shape. And Lauren, as I say, is constantly facing her own terrors, really. She's imperiled by a kind of psychological or affective disorder that makes her hyper-empathetic to the sufferings of others. The question is, can she exercise leadership and not be overwhelmed or destroyed physically or emotionally in the process? And this again speaks to me of the need to confront the realities of our predicament, but also to cultivate the right spiritual and emotional resources for the journey. What Donna Haraway, writing about Octavia Butler's work, terms a wounded flourishing, what we might also term resilience. And I would suggest that in the current climate crisis, surrounded by the imagery of apocalyptic tribulations, any Easter hope, any future hope of resurrection must nevertheless be tempered by the realism of Holy Saturday, of staying with and within the pain, the loss and fear of the present, with the full awareness of the toll that our current crisis takes, but responding without regret, denial, or regression. But this again is a resurrection that doesn't simply guarantee human salvation, but the renewal of the whole of creation. Again, a displacement of anthropogenic exceptionalism. So here I think of Hildegard von Bingen's metaphor for the resurrection, of viriditas, meaning the greening of the spirit, as an allusion to the resurrection as a form of cosmic spring, something she draws from Gregory of Nazianzus, something that rejuvenates all creation, not simply human affairs and not simply our own interior souls. Human salvation can't happen without the liberation of the totality of creation. Also thinking here of Elizabeth Johnson's idea of deep resurrection, working on eco-feminist ideas of deep creation. She talks about deep resurrection. So to conclude, much can be learned from an examination of the symbolic means by which issues of climate emergency and the impact of the Anthropocene are constructed, especially in popular culture. Many of these stress its disruptive force and imagine a range of responses to do with crisis or apocalypse and hope beyond the end times. The calling of the people of God is to declare and embody an alternative reality in anticipation of the world to come, a world that is and is not yet, but is the true reign of God. Biblical literature, I think, points not to annihilation of or escape from earthly affairs, but their transformation, albeit through tests and times that serve to purify and reorientate. Another world is possible, but it's not something that exists beyond, above, or in opposition to this one, but only in opposition in terms of our need to resist much of climate crisis, but not in opposition to, as in escape from or separation from. It's not something that exists beyond, separate from, or above this one. And this is a practical wisdom that is born from a realism and a determination to stay with the trouble, rather than deny or try to escape. So our task is both critical and constructive. We need to consider how a climate emergency and the impact of the Anthropocene challenge many of our perceptions, language, and theology. And we need to gather new tools and metaphors from science, arts, popular culture, the humanities, that enable a diagnosis of the predicaments that face us, and to learn to tell new stories, which often in fact turn out to be very old, that are capable of nurturing communities and practices of resilience, resistance, and transformation.